As I go back in the memory of how we got to where we are today, could I just run through a few of the issues that we had to deal with to get where we are. Some of those were pretty difficult, but before we do that, maybe I should just say a little bit of quick background. My wife's here with me. I have 3 children. Jonathan, one of my sons. Adam, you saw on the video, who basically is based in London now, overseeing the operation in London, and a daughter who lives in Sydney. We have 7 grandchildren, and we spend a lot of time with them, and we love to do so. Grew up on the central coast of New South Wales, trained as an engineering surveyor, and then left that very quickly and went into Bible college for 2 years, and then into the family business, which was running buses and some real estate development on the central coast of New South Wales. So that's a very quick background. From there, the family business was operating buses in and around Gosford to Woy Woy, Ettalong, Terrigal, those areas on the central coast, and it grew from there. But in 1985, the big change came. The father wanted to sell out and retire, so I got involved with Neil Smith, who you saw on there, and Lance Francis, our other business partner. And we bought a bus service here in Brisbane, which was Bayside Bus Lines back in '85. That business grew, and we were operating local buses, tourist buses, and express coaches in those days. And you might remember back to the late '80s and Expo, etc. Airfares were a lot dearer there in those days than they are today, and the express coach industry was growing significantly year on year. We were operating express coaches from Melbourne through to Sydney, Sydney to Brisbane, Brisbane to Cairns, etc. And we unfortunately had one of those serious bus accidents that you may remember back in October 1989. We received a phone call very early in the morning to say that there'd been an accident on the Pacific Highway down near Grafton, and that it looked like there were a number of fatalities. Well, it turned out to be 21 people had been killed when a truck driver went to sleep at the wheel after having driven from Melbourne to Brisbane, non-stop basically, and then unloaded his load there in Brisbane, and then reloaded and were headed back south to Sydney, and went to sleep at the wheel near Cowper, near Grafton, and effectively wiped out our coach. On a big bend, went straight ahead, instead of taking the bend, ploughed into the coach. 21 people were killed, and that was horrific tragedy, and just tore us apart. And as I went down there the next morning to see some of the people in the hospital. Some of the people on the coach were actually ex-friends of mine, and were basically told by the police that wasn't a good place for me to be at that stage, because no one sort of knew what had happened or who was to blame or who was at fault, etc. So we had to get out of there. And it was interesting from then on, because the business after that took a severe downturn financially, obviously, and our income dropped over 50% within 3 months. We were running 100 coaches on express services around Australia. So it was a very, very difficult time, not just financially and not just in the business, but obviously personally also, and with my wife and my children. I can remember going through bouts of severe depression, going down the street, feeling ashamed just to have been associated with this thing and to not know who was at fault, etc. You feel this weight on your shoulders. I mean, these families have been torn apart, etc., and you just don't know what to do. So it was a very difficult time, and as time went on, we couldn't do much about the deaths, obviously. If you could, that'd be the first thing you fix, but business goes on, life goes on, so you have to keep moving. We then had a situation with the bank, and when, as I said, we were running a number of local companies on the Central Coast, plus the express coach and tourist coach. So we had quite a big operation in those days. It was about 200 buses, and growing significantly up until the time of the accident. We then found that we had to cut back expenditure because we dropped 50% of our income, and obviously that meant that we had to make adjustments into our business to survive. We were able to do that. We kept going on for quite a while until we, in those days, you might remember back in the early 90s, someone's thought about 1961, let's talk about early 90s. You remember that interest rates in those days, believe it or not, were 17%. I can see some heads shaking around here, yeah, 17%. We had the situation where we had to pay a certain amount of money to the bank every month. And on one of those months, we received a lot of income from the education department for moving school kids on our buses. And they had a problem with their computer, which meant that they were going to pay us late by a few days, less than a week, they said. So I rang my bank, or our bank manager in Sydney, and said, look, you know, we won't be able to make the interest payments on time, but it will be here within a few days. The education department's got a problem with the computer and they can't pay us, blah, blah, blah. So they said, well, that's fine, that's not a problem. So we actually did pay them about 5 or 6 working days late, and they got their money. But what had happened was, because in the bank system a little red flag goes up, you didn't make your payment on time, even though you had paid it. Our manager changed from the manager we'd been with for 5 years to a new guy who was in a division of the bank called Corporate Recoveries. What a joke that was, but anyway, that's another story. And he said, well, seeing you missed your payment on time, you now, we've put you under penalty rates of interest. That was 23%. 23% we had to pay, and we continued to pay that. It was very difficult, but we did it. Up until the point one day where he called us to Sydney and said, we want to put an investigative accountant into your business to see if you're going to survive. And if not, then I said to the guy, what happens if he says we don't? He said, oh, well, we'd probably have to take action against your business. So I said to him, I said, well, all right, put an investigative accountant in, because we were surviving, we were going okay, and I thought the result would be good. But I said, it's not fair that you put an investigative accountant in who also in the same business or company has a receivership department, so that it's a conflict of interest, because they're going to say, yes, the business is not going to trade out, therefore we better put our receiver in and get control of the business, and then they run it and get their nose in the trough and away they go. So they said, fair enough. They were going to use a big firm in Brisbane, and they said gave us the name of another firm, which I forget these days. And we said, oh, well, that's fair enough. They're a smaller firm. That'll be great. So we didn't check up to see if they had a receivership level in their business, and they actually did. So the result came out that from the investigative account that they didn't believe that we could survive, so they should take action. Now at this point we had not defaulted. Yes, we had been late a little bit with one of our payments because of other circumstances. We had paid everything on time, and we then had a property that a bus depot we're developing over in Manly into a small retirement village, which I'd actually sold the property to Pioneer Homes, which was a large home builder in those days, and they were due to settle for the property at the end of March. This had been going on from the accident in 89. We're up to 91, 92 now, and the debt that we owed the bank was approximately $2.5 million. We were selling the property for $1.5 million at the end of March, and in the middle of February they called us to Sydney to have a meeting, and while we were in Sydney at the meeting they put the receivers in back at the bus companies in Brisbane while we were out of town. And I said to and when we went down there, they told us what they'd done. They deliberately called us out of the business to get us to Sydney. And I said to the guy, I said, well, hang on a minute, what are you doing this for? In 6 weeks, we're going to pay you over 50% of your debt back. He said, it's not going to settle. I said, what do you mean it's not going to settle? He said, the property will not settle. I don't believe it's going to settle. Therefore, we're taking action. I said, but we're not in default. We've paid all the money that you're owed. He said, yes, but under the fixed and floating charge, anyone has a fixed and floating charge on their business? Never sign those documents. Never ever sign those documents, because under a fixed and floating charge, they can take action if you sneeze the wrong way. And so what had happened was that they'd said that they had the right to take action against us because we had failed to give them monthly accounts. We have, for the last 6 years, been giving them quarterly accounts and audited accounts at the end of the 12 months. But they wanted monthly accounts. Well, no one gives monthly accounts, and they never asked for them, right? So, and they said we weren't fit and proper people to manage the business. So I said, well, what's changed in the last 6 years? 6 years ago you didn't have a problem with us, but now you've got a problem. We're not fit and proper people to manage the business. So at the end of the day, they took action, and sure enough, 6 weeks later, at the end of March, the property settled. They got over 2/3 of their money back on the debt within 6 weeks of taking action. There was also a stack of new buses that we bought that had been on lease. If anyone understands how a lease works, at the end of the lease, you have the right to buy the bus at the residual amount, or the vehicle, or whatever it is you've got leased. Or alternatively, you can give it back to the finance company. Well, the bank was so embarrassed by the fact that this property had actually settled that they cut off all communication with us. They wouldn't talk to us on the phone, they wouldn't answer our letters, they wouldn't speak to our solicitor. They just cut off everything, because I think they realised they were actually in a little bit of trouble. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough cash to take the bank on, and when the lease buses, there's about 20 of these buses came off lease, the residual value, I forget the exact numbers, but it was about $30,000, and the buses were valued at $70,000. So what they could have done was paid the lease out, resold the buses, and got another $800,000 of income, which would have paid out all the debt. So there was nothing basically outstanding. Didn't want to talk to us at all, wouldn't speak to us, wouldn't have any communication with us, and until this day, we have never ever received a letter from them setting out the final accounting on what had happened. But be that as it may, when they put the receiver in, obviously I go home from Sydney on the plane and get back to my wife and children and say, well, I'm out of work. We've lost everything. We don't have a business anymore. We don't have any income. So it was pretty tough times, and Jan and I went through some pretty rough times together. Very depressed. I remember one day after taking the kids to school in the car coming home, thinking, what am I going to do? I don't have a business. I can't really do anything. I've always been self-employed pretty well. I'm unemployable because I tell the boss what to do all the time, and I'm sure he wouldn't appreciate that. So, you know, I had to come to grips with this thing, and this went on for quite a while. How were we going to survive? Well, the only way we could survive was we still had a house, which the bank couldn't get a hold of, thank goodness, because it was in Jan's name. So we sold the house. We lived in a rented house, but that gave us some money. Oh, one other thing I forgot. When the bank wanted to take action, we had a property we bought in Cleveland to build a new bus depot on, because we're selling the old bus depot to Pioneer Homes that I mentioned before. And I offered it to the bank because I'd actually purchased the property and not the business, and said to the bank at the time, look, we can give you additional security to hold off for the 6 weeks of this property. And he said, no, I don't want it. I said, you don't want additional security? I said, no, I don't. So obviously there was something going on I didn't know about. I found out a little while later on that one of the guys, our assistant bank manager, who was a good guy, before they took it over to corporate recoveries. Corporate recovery is going to help you bring your business out of trouble, right? So to help you, we'll jack your interest rate from 17 to 23%. That should do you a lot of good and help you no end, you know. So we offered the other property to them, and they said no, they didn't want it. One of the assistant managers to our previous bank manager rang me up a few months later and said, Graham, I want to talk to you about what's gone on inside the bank. And I said, oh yeah, what's happened? And he said, well look, I no longer work for the bank. I couldn't work for them any longer. I was so ashamed of some of the things they did. Now this is not one of the big banks that's around today, and I'm not here to knock banks, because I think banks are obviously an important part of our society and our community. But this bank is now gone, so I can talk openly without the fear of being sued. So he said there was a position came up in the bank that the manager that we'd had for 5 or 6 years had applied for. And it was the same position that this guy that was in charge of corporate recoveries had applied for. So what he was trying to do was to embarrass our bank manager, to put to the heavies in the bank that he'd given some loans that he should have never given to some companies. And apparently we weren't the only company he did this to. There were 3 other companies, I was told, that he took similar action where there was absolutely no need to take the action. After we paid our debt, within 6 weeks, the hierarchy of the bank level realised they had a problem, and this guy got moved sideways and eventually dismissed. It didn't help us. The bank weren't prepared to say that they'd made a mistake, obviously, so they just put up the shutters and away we went. So we had this property in Cleveland that I'd offered, which they'd said no, thank goodness. And when we'd gone through selling the home, and that's all the cash we had to live on, plus this property, which in all honesty was costing us land tax and rates and all sorts of things that I didn't have the income to look after. So we had this property, and I went into the council to see the council and say, well, look, I need to sell this property. And they said, well, the guy sitting there said, this is your property here, we've got the plans. And I said, Dennis, that's not our property. He said, yes, it is. I said, Dennis, that's got all these blocks of land all over it. And he said, yeah, that's right, that's your property. It's all approved as a subdivision. I said, it's what? I bought this to build a bus depot on from a vendor that was keen to sell. He wanted settlement within 2 weeks. He didn't even tell me he'd had an approved subdivision on it. I didn't know it was until afterwards. And you know, that's the first bit where I want to say that there's a verse in Scripture in Isaiah 65 which says, before you called out to me, I answered you. Before you called out to me, I answered you. And he was the answer before we called out. So we had this property that was quite able to be developed, to make some money from, etc., and get ourselves back going again. And we did that subdivision. That was an interesting subdivision, and to raise the money because we had a problem with this bank. My accountant, whom I'd had for many years in Sydney, had a good friend at a major bank in Brisbane who rang him up and said, I want you to lend this money to Graham. I'll vouch for him. So that was my accountant. And I went in to see this bank manager and he said, well, I hear you've had some rough times. And I went through all the issues and he was fully aware of it. He said, well, how much money do you need to develop this property? And I said, gave him a figure. He said, no problem, you've got it. And I thought, this is so easy, how does this work? But it was because God had gone before and he'd set up the situation that even though I was a bad risk in most banks' eyes because I was basically headed towards a Part 10 or a receivership myself, bankruptcy, he actually lent us the money, we did the subdivision, and from that subdivision we were able to get some cash to get started again and to start the business rolling again. But I can remember one day when I think I said earlier, just the depression that was on top of me, and coming home with the kids, from taking the kids to school, sitting on the floor in this rented house because we had to sell our own home. The depression and just the pressure on you and the shame. Eventually, the coroner released his report on the bus accident and gave us 100% clearance. You know how sometimes with an accident they say, oh, you're 60% to blame and they're 40% to blame, and they apportion blame in a ratio. The coroner came out, Mr. Waller, and said, Sunliner Express has absolutely nothing in here to blame them for. They did the complete research. Our driver had only just got onto the coach 2 hours before in Port Macquarie or whatever, and the history of the truck driver, etc. So we were completely exonerated on the accident, which was great, but still 21 people have died, you know. It was horrific. So it was a very difficult time. But the issue there was when I sat there and cried this particular day to the Lord, why, Lord? What's happened? Why has this all happened? And to this day, I don't know why. But I knew that the faith that I had, that I gained through my parents, I suppose, stood me in good stead. And even though I was ashamed and I was extremely depressed, I held on to that. The Lord is good. He will honour his servants. And I received a letter from a friend of mine in Sydney in this period, and I'd like to read the verse that he sent to me. He said, I read this verse in the Bible yesterday. and your name came into my mind, and the Lord told me I had to send you this letter. So he wrote a letter and he printed out the verse, and the verse was, I'm sure you all know it, Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. You will call out to me and I will answer you. And that just lifted me completely. I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. And that's what we have. From that, I was out of transport, obviously, when I was into property development, and then for a while, my first love has always been transport, but we were also a little bit of property developers. So we started from that subdivision. I had enough money to buy another parcel of land and to build a small retirement village, which then from that I built a bigger one, and then along came a company called AMP who wanted to buy those retirement villages, and that gave us the money then to build a big retirement village that we're building now at Victoria Point called Renaissance Retirement Living, which is being built at the moment. We've built about 250 villas there, and we'll finish with the 320. In 1996, an opportunity came up with West Australian Government. They started to contract out their bus services. They wanted to save money, and there was a small bus operation of 42 buses that Neil Smith, you saw on the ad there, rang me up and said, would you like to get back into business running buses? And I said, I'd love to. And we put in a tender to operate that 42 bus service in Midland, in Perth. We won the contract. From that, a few years later, we ended up running about 400 buses in Perth, 350 in Adelaide and Sydney and Darwin, and it just grew topsy-turvy. And to this day, I really don't know why, other than one factor that really pushed home to me was after the subdivision we developed, we had some cash, we had some profits. And I thought, this is good, we'll be able to put this together and do some things. And the Lord said, but you've got to tithe. You've got to give back. And I said, no, I don't have enough money. Next time I make some money, I'll give it to you, Lord. But this kept coming back to me time after time. It was a real challenge. And my conscience just wouldn't let it go. I'd been brought up in a family where my father had always taught us to tithe and to give, etc., which was good training. But I had this conflict. Should I give, or maybe do it next time, Lord, you know? Finally, I said, oh, I've just got to write the cheque. And I think from that day on, I wasn't expecting to get anything back. The motive was just because I felt I had to give. And so we wrote that cheque, and I discussed it with my wife. We gave the money, and it was a significant amount of money to us, even though it wasn't a lot, but we didn't have much. So we gave the money. And then I look at what we have now, and I'm just staggered. I mean, there's 4,000 odd people we pay wages to every week. There's 2,000 odd buses, 170 million passengers a year. Look, just one, I'll close with this. There's a lovely verse that I love in Malachi 3:8, and it says, will a man rob God? And then he goes on and says, bring the full tithe of your comings into the storehouse of heaven and give to me, and thereby put me to the test. This is the only scriptures that I know where God says, put me to the test. Put me to the test. And he will honour that test. He has in my life, he has in our lives, he has in our business life. We have given regularly, on a regular basis. And I can tell you that the test we put him to, he just swamped us. I will open the floodgates of heaven and pour out a blessing upon you which you will not be able to contain. And I can say that's exactly what's happened to us.